After 32 years of marriage, Helen believed she knew everything about her life. The habits, the silences, the routines that quietly replaced passion. She thought love simply changed shape with time, that mornings became quieter, dinners shorter, conversations thinner, and that this was normal. She never suspected that what she called peace was actually something carefully maintained. Every photo on the wall told a story of stability. Every holiday card showed a smiling couple who had survived decades together. Friends admired their endurance. Their children called it a strong marriage, and Helen believed it too. Until one ordinary afternoon, when she opened a drawer she had never opened before. Inside were old letters, neatly tied with a faded ribbon, written in a handwriting she didn't recognize at first. Letters full of longing, secrecy, and promises that were never meant for her eyes. As she read, the years she trusted without question began to rearrange themselves. It wasn't rage she felt first. It was a quiet, sinking realization that her life had not been a shared story, but two separate ones, running side by side. And in that moment, Helen understood something terrifying. The betrayal hadn't ended long ago. It had simply learned how to hide in plain sight. Helen sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had begun to fade. The letters spread out in front of her like pieces of a life she had never been invited into. And with every line she read, she realized how carefully time had been edited for her, how entire emotions had been removed from the version of marriage she believed she lived. Because these were not careless notes or fleeting mistakes, but years of intention, patience, and secrecy, written in ink that had survived decades. And as she traced the dates with her fingers, she understood that while she had been building a home, celebrating anniversaries, raising children, and believing in shared sacrifice, another relationship had been quietly existing alongside hers, untouched by responsibility and protected by silence. And what hurt most was not the words themselves, but the tone of certainty within them, the confidence of a man who knew he would never be discovered, who trusted that routine and loyalty would keep his truth buried forever. And Helen felt something shift inside her that she could not undo. Because once you see the full shape of a lie, you can never return to the comfort of believing less. And as she gathered the letters back into a neat pile, she wasn't deciding what to say or how to confront him. She was realizing that the life she thought was solid had been balanced on a secret for longer than she ever knew. That night, Helen lay awake beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, a sound that had once comforted her but now felt unfamiliar, almost distant, and she wondered how many nights he had fallen asleep this easily while carrying a story she never knew. Because the hardest part was not imagining the betrayal itself, but realizing how effortlessly he had lived with it, how naturally deception had blended into ordinary life. And as she stared into the darkness, she replayed moments from the past that suddenly made sense. The unexplained absences, the emotional distance she blamed on stress, the way he sometimes looked relieved when she stopped asking questions. And she understood that her silence had not preserved peace, but had unknowingly protected his secret. And with that understanding came a quiet anger that did not burn or shout, but settled deep and heavy, because she was not mourning the loss of love alone, but the loss of informed choice, the years she might have lived differently had she been trusted with the truth. And as morning slowly approached, she realized she was standing at the edge of a decision that did not require confrontation to be real. Because whether she spoke or stayed silent, the marriage she believed in no longer existed, and the woman she would become next could not be the same one who went to sleep believing half a story. The next morning unfolded like any other, yet everything felt altered, as if Helen were moving through a familiar house that no longer belonged to her. And while he poured coffee and spoke about trivial plans, she noticed how practiced his calm was, how easily he filled the space with normality. And she wondered how many times she had done the same for him, smoothing over discomfort in the name of love. Because what frightened her most was not the betrayal itself, but how convincingly he continued the performance. And as she watched his hands move, confident and unshaken, she realized that honesty was not something he lacked the courage for, but something he had chosen to avoid. And this realization sharpened her resolve, because love that survives only through silence is not loyalty, but surrender. And she understood that if she confronted him too soon, she would receive rehearsed answers, apologies shaped to end the conversation, not truths meant to heal. So instead, she listened, storing every word, every expression, every inconsistency, letting patience become her strength. Because for the first time in years, she was not afraid of losing him, but of losing herself by accepting a version of life built on omission. And by the time he left the house, she stood alone in the quiet kitchen, knowing this was no longer about forgiveness or anger, but about reclaiming her voice before it faded completely. Later that afternoon, Helen left the house with no clear destination, driving familiar streets while her thoughts moved far beyond them. Because once the truth settles in, it begins to quietly rewrite every memory you thought was stable. And as traffic lights changed and storefronts passed by, she realized how much of her life had been organized around keeping things smooth rather than real. How often she had adjusted her expectations to match his moods, his silences, his convenient explanations. And in that realization, she felt a deep sadness that was not only about betrayal, but about time, about the decades spent believing that compromise was the same as intimacy. And she remembered moments when her intuition had whispered that something was off, and how quickly she had dismissed it in favor of harmony, telling herself that long marriages were supposed to feel like this, steady and predictable, even when they felt empty. And as she parked by a quiet park and sat in the car, she understood that what she was grieving was not the man beside her, but the woman she had been when she still trusted herself without hesitation. And in that stillness, she made a quiet promise, not to confront yet, not to demand explanations, but to stop shrinking her truth to fit someone else's comfort. Because whatever came next had to be built on honesty, even if that honesty changed everything she had known. That evening, as the house filled with familiar evening sounds, Helen moved through her routine with deliberate slowness, noticing details she had ignored for years. The way light fell across the hallway, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock that suddenly felt louder than before. And she realized how much of her life had been lived on autopilot, trusting that consistency meant safety. And as she prepared dinner, she thought about all the conversations that never happened, the questions she softened or abandoned altogether, not because she feared the answers, but because she feared disrupting the image of a stable life. And now that image felt fragile, almost artificial, like a carefully arranged room no one was allowed to touch. And when he spoke to her that night, she listened closely, not to the words themselves, but to the ease with which they came, the confidence of someone who believed the past was sealed and forgotten. And instead of anger, she felt clarity, because she understood that betrayal is not always explosive. Sometimes it is quiet, prolonged, and normalized until it becomes part of the background. And standing there, she accepted a difficult truth, that love cannot survive where truth is optional. And while she still did not know what decision she would make, she knew she would no longer pretend that ignorance was peace, because awareness, once gained, demands movement, even if that movement takes time. That evening, as the house filled with familiar evening sounds, Helen moved through her routine with deliberate slowness, noticing details she had ignored for years. The way light fell across the hallway, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock that suddenly felt louder than before. And she realized how much of her life had been lived on autopilot, trusting that consistency meant safety. And as she prepared dinner, she thought about all the conversations that never happened, the questions she softened or abandoned altogether, not because she feared the answers, but because she feared disrupting the image of a stable life. And now that image felt fragile, almost artificial, like a carefully arranged room no one was allowed to touch. And when he spoke to her that night, she listened closely, not to the words themselves, but to the ease with which they came, the confidence of someone who believed the past was sealed and forgotten. And instead of anger, she felt clarity, because she understood that betrayal is not always explosive. Sometimes it is quiet, prolonged, and normalized until it becomes part of the background. And standing there, she accepted a difficult truth that love cannot survive where truth is optional. And while she still did not know what decision she would make, she knew she would no longer pretend that ignorance was peace, because awareness, once gained, demands movement, even if that movement takes time. In the days that followed, Helen began to see her marriage not as a single story, but as layers that had been quietly stacked over time. And with each ordinary interaction, she noticed how carefully emotions had been managed, how honesty had been replaced with politeness, and how questions had been avoided in favor of routine. And she understood that betrayal rarely announces itself, but instead survives through comfort and predictability. And as she folded laundry and sorted through years of shared belongings, she reflected on how many moments she had mistaken familiarity for intimacy, how many evenings she had accepted silence as understanding. And this awareness did not arrive with fury, but with a deep, steady heaviness, because she was not confronting a single act, but an entire pattern of avoidance that had shaped her life. And she realized that even if the affair had ended long ago, its impact had not, because secrets do not expire simply because time passes. They remain active until they are acknowledged. And in recognizing this, she felt a shift from confusion to resolve, understanding that whatever future she chose would require courage, not in leaving or staying, but in refusing to live another year pretending that half-truths were enough. And with that realization, she felt something rare and powerful settle within her, the certainty that silence would no longer be her contribution to someone else's deception. One quiet afternoon, Helen found herself sitting in the living room, surrounded by photographs collected over decades, images of vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary days that once felt meaningful simply because they were shared. And as she studied each frame, she realized how memory can be selective, how easily happiness can be curated while truth remains absent. Because every smiling image now carried an unspoken question about what had been happening beyond the edges of the picture. And she thought about how often she had been present physically while emotionally adapting herself to what was expected, minimizing doubts, rationalizing distance, and telling herself that this was the natural rhythm of a long marriage. And as she traced the faces in those photographs, she understood that she had been loyal not just to a person, but to an idea of stability that demanded silence and return. And this recognition brought a deep emotional fatigue rather than anger, because maintaining an illusion over time requires constant self-editing. And she finally acknowledged how tired she was of being the one who preserved calm at the cost of clarity. And in that moment, she did not feel ready to confront or decide, but she felt unmistakably ready to stop pretending that time alone could heal what honesty never touched. And that realization stayed with her, heavy but grounding, like a truth that could no longer be set down. The morning she finally decided to speak, Helen did not feel nervous or afraid, only steady, as if weeks of silent reflection had slowly aligned her thoughts into something unshakable. And as she sat across from him, she noticed how ordinary the moment looked from the outside. Two people at a table, years of shared history between them, yet internally everything had already shifted, because she was no longer asking for explanations or permission to feel hurt. She was simply stating what she now knew. And as she spoke calmly, without accusation or raised emotion, she realized how powerful truth becomes when it is no longer tangled with desperation. And while he struggled to respond, offering fragments of justification and regret, she understood that his words no longer held authority over her understanding of the past, because clarity had already done its work. And in that moment, she felt the weight of decades lift slightly, not because the pain disappeared, but because it finally had a name. And as the conversation ended, she did not feel victorious or broken, only free. Free from carrying a story that was never fully hers, free from protecting a silence that cost her more than it gave. And as she stepped forward into whatever future awaited her, she knew that healing would not be quick or simple, but it would be honest. And that honesty, after a lifetime of compromise, felt like the most profound form of peace she had ever known.